The Red Ring of Death crisis, the failed launch of Xbox One, how employees at Microsoft originally hated the Xbox brand, and how the Xbox brand basically exists because of Sony. These are just some of the stories that were told during a recent IGN podcast. So Ryan McCaffrey got to sit down and had a roundtable discussion with three of the most influential people in Microsoft with Xbox. So we got to talk with Seamus Blackley, who helped design and start the original Xbox, Peter Moore, who was in charge and overseeing the Xbox during the 360 days and who now is helping run EA, and then Phil Spencer, who's currently in charge. So if you're a fan of gaming, even if you don't like the Xbox, this was a conversation that I would still recommend because it gives you a raw behind-the-scenes look at how companies like this operate, how divisions are formed. And surprisingly, I mean, it wasn't just an interview where they had a bunch of softball questions. Like, there were some really very transparent discussions that were being had during this podcast. So it's an hour and a half long, but I did want to bring you some of the biggest stories that I took away from hearing it if you don't have time to sit down for an hour and a half. So according to Seamus, the reason the Xbox marketing is that green color that you see everywhere is whenever they were working on the original Xbox, they were in a room drawing up plans, and there was a cup full of markers on the table. So everybody was grabbing their markers to take down notes or whatever, and only one color was left, and that was green, that nobody wanted. And so the person drawing on the board, you know, writing the notes for everybody, that was the color they used. And so that's the color they ended up actually going with, is that green. So according to all three men, the Xbox brand really wasn't embraced for a long time by Microsoft employees. And Microsoft was, of course, primarily a software company. At the time, they were literally running some of the world's largest money generators like Office and, of course, Windows. And these companies, or these divisions within the company, were bringing in billions of dollars in profit. Like $1 billion wasn't nothing for them in order to be making. And then you had the Xbox division, which was losing tons of money. And so they were at these same meetings together with all these other divisions, and they're trying to, you know, secure and ask for money while these other ones are just pumping it out like it's a printing press. And so the Xbox division actually lost money for several years, even after the 360 came out. And they claimed that people would come up to them, you know, at lunch or whatever, who worked in other divisions, and I mean, they were resented. The fact that this division existed within Microsoft, a lot of people didn't like, because people would tell them that they were helping to keep shares down at Microsoft, and these are people who are financially invested in the company. So like a lot of people at Microsoft, of course, buy Microsoft stock, and they felt like the Xbox division was actually keeping them down. But thankfully for Xbox gamers, Bill Gates was a big backer of the division, and now they've been able to turn that you know, kind of outlook around at Microsoft, and it's considered a cool part of Microsoft with the employees now. And they also realized that the Xbox division gave them a fan base that you couldn't get elsewhere, because you know, dealing with different industries, there's very few like the gaming industry where you have quote-unquote fans, you know, people who are, you know, looking up to these people, who are constantly in interaction with them. You know, fans tweet out all day long at these people. You don't have that with other software companies. You don't have that within other areas within Microsoft where you have a legitimate fan base. And so that helps your brand, of course, overall. That helps Microsoft. So Bill Gates, he saw this, and so the people who have been in charge over Microsoft for the past few years, they've also seen the importance of the Xbox brand, and that's how it existed, even though people within Microsoft didn't really care for it, who were working in other parts. And one thing that I did think that was sort of interesting was how they talked about how if you're a software business like Microsoft is, you're building these operating systems and everything, it eventually always comes back to games. Because if you can build a system that runs games really well, then the system is going to run any other program also well. So that was why they also looked at the Xbox division as being so important to the overall ecosystem for Microsoft. So Peter Moore was in charge of the Xbox 360 launch. He also talked about how they were pretty much partying backstage during the PS3 reveal because Sony announced that their console was going to cost $599, which of course was huge, especially during that period of time. But he was also in charge of the Red Ring incident. And I think this is probably the most interesting story that I heard during the whole podcast. So according to Moore, they didn't realize that they had a problem for a while with the Red Rings. This was, before Twitter, before social media, before everybody was posting up that, their console was broke. But they started eventually getting in a lot of feedback from stores, feedback from customers, and they realized that they had a big problem. And one of the problems was that they didn't even know what was causing it originally. They knew that it was heat related, but they didn't know why. And one theory was that they had to remove lead that they were using in their soldering because they had to meet European standards, and Europeans wouldn't allow lead to be in their products. And so they thought that maybe the lack of lead was helping to cause out the solder because of the heat. And Peter said that he was really nervous because he knew that they had to go and tell the Microsoft boss at the time, which was Steve Ballmer, that they had a big problem on their hand. And so he went to Steve and explained that this situation, he called it their Tylenol moment. And so for people who may not be aware, back in the early 80s, people were actually dying from taking Tylenol. Somebody had tampered with the capsules and had put cyanide in them. And so Johnson & Johnson stopped all production and advertising and actually did a nationwide recall where they pulled all Tylenol from all the store shelves. And they actually didn't sell Tylenol for several weeks while they were doing this investigation, trying to find out what actually happened. And then once they found out, then they had to do a whole campaign and marketing segment in order to get the public to feel safe being able to take Tylenol again. So Peter called this the Tylenol moment, and he told Steve that if they didn't address this, that the Xbox brand was dead. There was no more Xbox. And he also said that he knew gamers didn't want to be without a console, especially if they had just, recently bought this and it ended up red ringing pretty soon. So he told Steve in order to fix this, they needed to FedEx boxes overnight to customers. They also needed to send a box back to the customers overnight. And so this had to be a very fast turnaround so that people weren't without their consoles for very long. And he estimated that it was going to cost them $1.15 billion, with $240 million of that just going to FedEx alone. And he said when he told Steve this, Steve didn't hesitate for a second and immediately said, do it, without thinking. So he credits Ballmer for greenlighting the $1.15 billion in an instant in order to save the Xbox brand. And he said he was scared at the time that Microsoft stock was going to take a dive and go low, but he said the stock didn't actually move at all during this whole ordeal. And they also talked about how Redmond pretty much had paranoia with Sony, and that Sony had made several comments about wanting to take over the living room. And so this freaked Microsoft out, and this is actually the main reason why Xbox even exists. And Moore talked about how important it is to have strong competition with multiple people, within this industry, and how it's important for people within the industry, to put food on the table, because developers need to sell their games and they need to have different products in order to sell those games on. And it's also important for consumers. And we've talked about this before, you do not want to live in a world where there is no Sony PlayStation, or where there's only a Microsoft Xbox. And you don't want to be in a world without Microsoft Xbox or Nintendo either, because if you get to that point and say that it's only Microsoft around, then you have what we had at the Xbox launch. You have a system where there's a digital trade-in policy that's confusing as hell. 24-hour check-in, a lack of direction, and focus on games. And without Xbox, you might get more $600 consoles, or no desire to fix an online network with PlayStation, or for everybody, especially the consumers. So I don't want to see Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft drop out of this industry because it means fewer choices and less innovation. And speaking of innovation, they also talked about how the direction and messaging was way off during the launch and reveal of the Xbox One. And Phil, who's been with the company since the 80s, talked about how this past year has really been one of his favorites working with the company because they've been able to get back on focus and they've been able to turn it around and really start bringing the console back to games, bring it back to, you know, features that gamers actually want and care about, like backwards compatibility or being able to stream your games to other devices that you have. So you can thank Sony partly for that, because without Sony, Microsoft may not have been as focused to turn things around. And you can also thank Phil taking over with his new team and kicking out the people who weren't very good at their jobs and really had no idea where they wanted to take Xbox. So whether you like Xbox or not, I definitely recommend going and listening to this podcast, and you'll probably leave with a newfound respect for all three of these guys. And if you listen to it, let me know what your favorite part was. And thank goodness Don Matrick wasn't there, because that guy was an idiot. That does it for me, the Red Dragon. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.